In this quick video, I'm going to walk you through the settings section of Autopilot, pointing out a few things that you may want to customize based upon how you're using Autopilot. This video is currently based upon version 2.2 of Autopilot. As new features and modes are added to the product, we will continue to update the settings. It is strongly recommended that you familiarize yourself with each setting and confirm or change the default values before your first flight with Autopilot. Please also note that there are settings, in particular the camera settings, that are still only currently accessible within the DJI Go app. These features and settings will be added based upon overall time, priorities, and API availability. Use caution when changing the default values for settings that affect additional safeguards that Autopilot imposes, such as the max distance destination parameter. The default values for these settings were carefully selected after hundreds of hours of real-world flight testing to provide a balance between safety and usability. You should also note that the settings are saved across settings, so you may want to validate selected settings based upon your current situation and flight plan. So let's start with privacy. Privacy will bring you off to your iPad or your iPhone's settings section, and there's really just 5 options. For the most part, I'd leave these alone. You want to allow Autopilot access to your location. The microphone setting allows you to record yourself talking as you fly for flight analysis. Background app refresh allows apps to fetch new content in the background, but Autopilot does not currently use this feature, so it can be disabled if you prefer. Using cellular data just allows the system to download information when you're not on Wi-Fi. Let's go back and we'll go to the first section, General. These settings are relatively straightforward. Unit settings is either imperial for feet, miles per hour, etc., versus metric, which is meters, kilometers per hour. I'm going to leave it on imperial. The geo coordinates displays the latitude and longitude as degrees or degrees, minutes, and seconds. The default aircraft type is the aircraft type to start searching for when the app first opens. Autopilot was enhanced to properly identify the quad you are flying. This simply speeds up the startup process. The default map type. This is the map that the system will select when you first open screens such as the flight dashboard. Based upon your data plan, you may want to set this to standard versus hybrid or terrain, which tend to be more data intensive. If we go back, the map icon size is the size of the icons on the map. Larger icons are easier to select and move around, but may result in more overlapping. I tend to like medium or large. Anonymous usage data. This is a toggle which allows the system to send anonymous usage data to our server. The types of data include which modes are being engaged, how often they're being engaged, and with what control values. This data is not tied to any identifying piece of information about you, and we use it primarily to decide where we will spend our time improving future versions of the app. See our privacy policy for more information. So let's move down to the Airspace Manager. And there really are just 2 features specific to Airspace, and there will be a separate video taking you through how to use Airspace at another time. The device call sign is the identified name of your screen. It will either be what you enter in here, or it will be the name of your iPad or iPhone. By default, it is the name chosen for the phone or tablet as reported by the iPhone or tablet. The aircraft call sign is the way to identify the quadcopter, particularly when you have multiple quads in the air and airspace. If you leave it blank and the aircraft is connected, it will attempt to use the name that you specified when you registered the aircraft with DJI Go. If the SDK doesn't identify the quad for some reason, the call sign will be the aircraft type at the device. If you do enter something into settings, this will be the name of the aircraft, regardless of the aircraft connected. So if you set it to something for your Phantom 3, and then you switch it over to your Inspire, it's going to use the same aircraft call sign. For that reason, I personally recommend leaving this blank, as it will automatically and dynamically change the aircraft call sign based upon the craft connected. We'll do a longer video on how to use Airspace soon, but just so you can see how this looks, here we are in Airspace Manager. We've got one tablet, the slider, and we've got an aircraft, which is the Inspire, set up as Iceman. Then we've got another tablet. It's actually an iPad Air 2, which is set up as Goose, and we have the Phantom 3 set up as Maverick. When you zoom into the map, you'll be able to see each of the 4 devices by their call sign name. Onto the flight director settings. The engage countdown is the amount of time to wait before Autopilot will engage after tapping continue on the final screen of the engage sequence. The low battery warning here is the battery percentage at which to place a visual warning on the flight dashboard. If Autopilot is engaged in the background, a notification will also be generated. The dynamic home location, you can toggle this off or on to update the home location of the aircraft when Autopilot is engaged. If this is enabled and the iOS device or RC has a valid location, the home location will be updated at most every 1 second. Enabling dynamic home location also allows you to drag the home icon on the map to set the home location to a point of interest. This can be useful if you're flying in a boat and want to set the home location to be on land. The pause when telemetry is unavailable. This is a toggle to instruct Autopilot to automatically pause flight when the aircraft telemetry is unavailable. The disengage with RC control mode. This is a toggle to instruct Autopilot to disengage if the remote control mode changes. For example, if you switch from P to F. I tend to leave this off. The disengage on answer phone call. This is a toggle to instruct Autopilot to disengage if a phone call is answered when engaged. Not when it rings, but when it's answered. And the final option is to reset the gimbal on disengage. This is a toggle to enable resetting the gimbal to FPV follow mode, which is pointing straight ahead, when Autopilot is disengaged. The responsiveness is the shortest amount of time that Autopilot is allowed to completely reverse the power output on a given axis. For example, if we've selected 1 second, I've got 2 seconds selected here, the aircraft will not shift from 100% forward pitch to 100% backward pitch in less than 1 second, or 2 seconds here. Higher values will favor smoother motion changes, while lower values will favor more precise aircraft positioning. The altitude priority, this is the maximum allowable difference between the current aircraft altitude and the target altitude. If the distance is exceeded either positively or negatively, Autopilot will ascend or descend to close the gap before performing any other operations, such as lateral movement, and a visual warning will be displayed on the flight dashboard. If the aircraft is in motion when the altitude priority is activated, you may see the aircraft stop abruptly. Autopilot must assume that danger is imminent and therefore it prefers powered braking over smooth flight. The minimum altitude is the altitude at which Autopilot is allowed to operate, also known as the hard deck. If the aircraft is below this altitude while Autopilot is engaged, a visual warning will be displayed on the flight dashboard. If the selected mode is a computer or combined flight mode, Autopilot will automatically ascend above this altitude before performing any other actions. Values less than 5 meters or 16 feet are considered to be unsafe and should not be used in most cases. As discussed in the limitations section, Autopilot does not have collision avoidance, which makes altitude operations exceptionally risky. Additionally, due to the inaccuracy of GPS altimeters, Autopilot will not engage with a GPS altitude reference when using a min altitude less than 5 meters or 16 feet. Similarly, the max altitude is the maximum altitude at which Autopilot is allowed to operate. Any limits imposed by the aircraft firmware also take precedence over this setting. Next, we're going to look at the max distance. The max distance is the maximum distance from the aircraft home location at which Autopilot is allowed to operate. If the aircraft is further away from this distance, Autopilot will instruct the aircraft to assume a hover and a visual warning will be displayed on the flight dashboard. Any limits imposed by the aircraft firmware take precedence over this setting. Also note, if you have a very large value selected for the max distance destination parameter, it can make the distance sliders hard to operate. You can use a low value for the max distance mode control setting to make the slider easier to manage. The max vertical power is the maximum power that Autopilot is allowed to use for ascending or descending. Go back. The adaptive horizontal power toggle, when enabled, Autopilot will constantly monitor the pitch and roll output relative to the ground speed at a given direction when engaged. Over time, Autopilot will use machine learning to construct a velocity reference frame that can be used to dynamically adjust the horizontal power output. These adjustments can help overcome environmental factors such as variable wind speed and air density, but only after sufficient flight time in a given direction. Bottom line, this feature, this toggle, allows your quad to fly smoother around wind. The yaw sensitivity is the range of degrees, either plus or minus, that Autopilot attempts to stay within when attempting to yaw the aircraft to a given heading. For example, if 3 degrees is selected and Autopilot wants to point at 90 degrees, in other words due east, any aircraft heading between 87 and 93 degrees will result in 0 yaw. The heading if gimbal yaw enabled option. This is the preferred heading that Autopilot should use for aircraft types that support gimbal yaw, specifically the Inspire 1. This setting only applies when yaw enabled if available is on. The maximum distance is the maximum distance that Autopilot can set destinations from the current aircraft location. If the destination is further than this distance, Autopilot will instruct the aircraft to assume a hover and display a visual warning on the flight dashboard. This is a key setting if you're setting locations for zip lines and eventually the waypoint feature that is forthcoming. The max horizontal accuracy. This is the maximum allowable horizontal accuracy for destination locations. For example, the destination location during follow mode will have the same horizontal accuracy as the leader location. If the accuracy is exceeded, Autopilot will stop lateral movement and a visual warning will be displayed on the flight dashboard. Let's move on to the gimbal parameters. First is the responsiveness. This is the shortest amount of time that Autopilot is allowed to completely reverse the target gimbal angle on a given axis. For example, if 1 second is selected, the target gimbal pitch will not shift from 0 degrees to minus 90 degrees in less than 1 second. Lower values will result in more abrupt gimbal changes and less steady video. Let's look at pitch sensitivity. This is similar to the yaw sensitivity movement parameter, but with respect to the gimbal pitch instead of the aircraft heading. The yaw sensitivity is similar to the yaw sensitivity movement parameter, but with respect to the gimbal yaw instead of the aircraft heading. And then finally, the yaw enabled if available toggle. This is the toggle to allow Autopilot to set the gimbal yaw on the Inspire 1. If the setting is off, aircraft will rely upon the aircraft yaw to frame shots. Bottom line, for all intents and purposes, if you turn this off, it makes your Inspire 1 act like a Phantom 3 from a gimbal perspective. The level allows you to limit the controls shown in the various modes. So if I set it to basic, only the basic options will show. If I set it to intermediate, the basic and the intermediate options will show. If I set it to advanced, both the basic, intermediate, and advanced options will show. The max altitude, this is the maximum value that can be inputted for altitude-related mode controls, specified as a percentage of the max altitude movement parameter. I tend to keep this at 90 to 100%. The max distance, this is the maximum value that can be input for distance-related mode controls, specified as a percentage of the max distance target percentage. This should probably be around 80-90% as well. Next is the RC input if enabled toggle. This toggle is set to allow Autopilot to set mode controls by using the input from the remote control. For example, if you move the left remote control wheel, the gimbal wheel, in focus mode, Autopilot will automatically keep the shot framed at the same angle until you move it again. If you move the left remote control joystick up in follow mode, Autopilot will increase the altitude. Each mode control that supports RC input is marked within the Modes section. And you can see this in demonstration in many of the other videos. The final option here is the multi-value selection style. Render mode controls that have a defined list of possible values as a pop-up, which is default starting with the latest version, or inline, which is the behavior prior to version 2.2. The pop-up style has the advantage of reducing clutter at the expense of requiring 2 taps to make a change to a mode control. Now let's do the flight dashboard. The default view, if the screen size or orientation only allows one view to be displayed, start with this view selected. I tend to leave the map to start. The hardware video decoding, this you can toggle to enable hardware video decoding. This significantly reduces the processing power required to render frames in the video previewer, which can minimize the chance of a device overheating. I tend to leave this on. Next is the telemetry detail. This sets the level of detail to control how many data points are displayed on the flight dashboard telemetry tapes. If you've seen the videos about the user interface, this is the information on the left and the right of the screen. The theme option provides you an option to either have a dark or a light user interface. And the inline controls preferred toggle, this is a toggle to display the mode controls panel inline. The screen size must be large enough, iPad only at this time, and the selected mode must have controls in order for the system to apply. I've done it both ways, both on and off. Next we have the flight recorder section. The data logging is what you can toggle off or on to enable logging the flight, engagement, and airspace data. The start video or engage has the aircraft camera start recording once you hit engage, and obviously the stop video and engage stops the video once you disengage the record audio while engaged is something you can use to toggle to record the audio from your microphone on your iOS device while engaged. It gives you an opportunity to kind of talk yourself through the flight. It's good for note-taking or going back and understanding what you were thinking about when you were flying. The discard audio on disengage, this is a toggle to delete the iOS device audio that was recorded while engaged. Next two options are talk to the quality of the audio that's being recorded. The audio format is AAC. You can record it in Apple Lossless or AAC. And the audio bit rate, this is just the quality. Probably fine to do it at 160. The continuous photos option, when enabled, will allow Autopilot to take a photo at the selected interval like an intervalometer. Enabling the setting will disable video recording. When recording fast intervals, such as 2 seconds, you may need to capture photos in a compressed format or at a lower resolution, as the maximum write speed of the SD card becomes a limitation. Finally, Healthy Drones. This section is based upon the integration with the Healthy Drone service. Previously, this data would need to be manually imported into the system. With this recent enhancement, the data can be automatically uploaded immediately after you fly, and as long as you have data connectivity. I'm going to show you quickly how to get your user token from the Healthy Drone service. I'm assuming that you've created an account in Healthy Drones. Simply log in, click on your name in the upper right hand corner, and it'll bring you to a place where you'll see your user token in the center of the screen, which I've blurred out. Copy that into the settings, you'll be good to go. Finally, you can turn on cellular data, which will upload the data to Healthy Drones when you're not on Wi-Fi. Bottom line, Autopilot will continue to be enhanced. This will result in additional modifications to the settings as needed. Keep flying, and let us know how we can further enhance your experience with Autopilot.